Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 1110. This is your week 10 in-depth lecture in which we will be talking about how to research and write an annotated bibliography. Now, this is for the week of July 11th to July 17th, and we are going to be really concentrating on, now that we understand what the prompt is for the annotated bibliography, how do you go about selecting secondary sources? What does that process look like? And once you have them, what do you do with them? So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, what's on the agenda for today is kind of two primary topics, and I've kind of shown beneath each of them what the kind of subcategories of focus are. So we have the annotated bibliography, where we'll be talking about what is a secondary source, a visual walkthrough of the prompt, why an annotated bibliography, writing an entry or citation, writing an annotation, and examples of citations and annotations. Now, for the secondary source, we'll be also thinking about the research process of where to begin, becoming more specific, how to make use of Google Scholar, and how to make use of the OSU library. So let's begin with the annotated bibliography. If you recall from the beginning of the semester, I defined a secondary source as the secondary source of ideas and information. This text is used to inform, question, and shape your thoughts about your primary source. Now, I kind of mentioned that, the textbook that would typically be used for this class defines a secondary source as a written text, such as academic papers, magazine or newspaper articles, essays, or chapters from books that examine objects, data, or phenomena and make analytical claims about them. But as I mentioned earlier in the semester, and I'm kind of re-mentioning now, and a secondary source doesn't necessarily need to be a written text. It could very much be, an interview. It could be a documentary. It could take another form. Now, in a snapshot, again, the annotated bibliography is all about kind of giving you an opportunity to, learn the process of preparing a works cited page in MLA format, to give you the opportunity to read and familiarize yourself with secondary sources related to your primary source, and to reflect on and plan out how you might incorporate secondary research most effectively into an essay if you were to pursue the final paper option for the semester final project. Now, how do you go about doing it? First, you'll need to find secondary sources that relate to what you wrote about in your primary source analysis in some way. And again, the primary source is the music video, film trailer, photograph, poster, etc., that you selected for the last major assignment. And then I kind of recap for you here different examples of potential secondary source types. After you find possible secondary sources to use, you will then write a 300 to 500 word annotation for each source that includes information like the article's argument, how it connects to your primary source, etc. So I've created kind of a map for you here of the different stages of this process. So you'll first need to start by researching secondary sources on Google Scholar, OSU Libraries Online, and on Google. Then you'll need to skim a variety of secondary sources and commit to 2 to 3 secondary sources. Again, one must be a scholarly article or book chapter. The other 2 can be various credible secondary sources. You'll then want to deep read the secondary sources that you committed to, take detailed notes as you deep read on the text argument and evidence, take detailed notes as you deep read on how this text connects to your primary source, and then proceed to write an entry for each secondary source in MLA style. And then, of course, when you write an annotation for each secondary source, it should be a single-spaced paragraph that appears under the entry, with each entry being 300 to 500 words and following the DISCA acronym. Whew, okay, lots of information there, right? So if we look at this first tier of things that you need to do, it's basically your research tier. Look for things, skim a bunch of things, commit to a few. Okay, that's the first bracket, if you will. This middle phase right here is about kind of preparing yourself for writing the assignment. This is where you're going to deep read those sources that you initially skimmed, take detailed notes on your deep read that focus on the argument and evidence of the text, take detailed notes on your text that focus on how your text connects to the primary source. And then finally, the final stage of this process is about actually doing the writing of the assignment, where you write an entry for each source in each secondary source in MLA style. You're going to write an annotation for each secondary source, and each of those annotations should be a single-spaced paragraph, with each of those paragraphs following DISCA and being 300 to 500 words. Okay, so research, note-taking, write the citation and annotation. Now, why do you need to write an annotated bibliography? Well, it functions as the precursor to the outline for a long-form project like a thesis-driven argumentative essay. The annotated bibliography is the step in which you pair your observations from the PSA with your findings from secondary sources that engage with the themes and or primary source of your project. So your observations / close readings plus insight from secondary sources help give shape to your thesis statement and argumentative essay. And so just to kind of pause here for a moment. So the reason that you write an annotated bibliography is because it's going to help you really sketch out, what are you planning to write about in this project? But more specifically, it's going to help you start to bring together the close readings that you've already done on this primary source in your PSA and think about how you can kind of extend or enhance their impact by connecting them to secondary sources of, writers who might have looked at other elements of this argument that you didn't necessarily look at in your own close readings, okay? And so that's how you get your observations and close readings plus insight from secondary sources that are going to help shape your thesis statement and argumentative essay. Now, it also gives you space to process and review the content and central argument of each secondary source in advance of writing an argumentative essay. This will prevent you from attempting to compress the research, review, and writing process all into one. I cannot tell you how many times that when I have written my own project of sorts, that when I try to do all of the processing and reviewing in one go, it's just a big mess, right? So this is about intentionally trying to get you to set aside time to do research, time to kind of think through how it might, benefit or reformulate the argument that you're working on before you even go about doing kind of any potential revision of the PSA, if you choose to pursue that for the final project, or just in general kind of help you to think about, is it even useful for you to pursue this for your final? So let's talk about the parts of an annotated bibliography. You need to go about writing a citation or an entry for each of the sources that you ultimately commit to in this project. So the citation is the part of the annotated bibliography that tells your reader who wrote the text, what it is called, and when / where it was published, so that other people conducting research on these topics can locate these sources if desired, and your reader can see the work that you did to arrive at the conclusions that you did. So it's almost kind of like, in some ways, it's sort of like showing your work when it comes to a math equation, okay? Now, when you are going about putting these citations together, you'll need to use MLA format in 8th edition. The citation should be written above the annotation for each entry of your annotated bibliography. So you'll always have these two parts together, okay? Make sure to write a citation for each secondary source that you include in your annotated bibliography. Helpful hint, write a citation for each source as you find it. This will save you time rather than having to double back to write this information. Okay, so again, we write a citation for the reason that if somebody else who's doing work in this area is looking for this particular text, they're able to find it. And you're going to also be able to demonstrate the work that went into crafting the argument that you put together. And so for each citation, you'll use MLA format and make sure that each of your citations and annotations are kind of put together. And do that work as you go, right? As you find sources and decide to commit to it, write the information down for the citation. Now, writing an annotation, again, follows the acronym DISCA of describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate. You will want to divide up the space in your annotation, which should consist of 300 to 500 words, between these 4 categories. That is, go in order and allot some of your total word count towards each of these categories. This will make writing the annotation a lot easier, but it will also help to ensure that you address everything that you need to in your review before moving to a longer essay, if you choose to pursue one in the final project, okay? Now, sometimes students will take this to mean that they should balance their word count with every single part of this, and that's not the case. As I mentioned briefly in the overview lecture, the connect and anticipate parts of your DISCA should take up more of your word count than describe and summarize. And the reason for this, of course, is that when you're describing and summarizing, you're recapping information for us in a way that's necessary, but isn't necessarily telling us anything new. And the connect and anticipate is where you're really bringing us that new intellectual kind of intellectual labor in terms of determining, how exactly you're going to use this source, but also the source's usefulness to your project. So again, describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate, which I talk about in the overview lecture, are kind of the components of how you want to go about writing each of your annotations. So describe is going to be all about telling us, where did you get this information from? who created it, who put it together. The describe section is going to be really important in terms of it's establishing the credibility and credentials for your secondary source. So with describe, you're going to want to be clear of, looking into what are the credentials of the writer of this piece. Did they go to a university? Are they a researcher? Where do they work? Are they a full-time staff writer at this, magazine that they're writing for, et cetera, right? What are their credentials to write on this topic? And if you recall from the week that we talked about kind of patriotism in the US, I did a similar kind of thing with Dennis Green, where I walked through, these are the credentials we know of for him. Here's where he's or what topics he's been focusing on in his writing, et cetera, et cetera. Now, beyond kind of describing, the source's credibility in terms of where it was published and the credentials of the person who produced it, the summarize section is going to be about where you are recapping and synthesizing the author's main argument. So you're going to want to be really clear in stating this is what they're arguing or this is what their message is. Now, depending on the type of text that you're using, there might not necessarily be an argument per se, but you want to be clear in establishing in this section, what is the purpose of this text existing? What are they saying on the topic? What are they providing? What are they talking about, basically? The connect section is about where you concentrate more so on bringing a point of connection between this secondary source and the primary source you've decided to write about for the PSA. And so here's where you want to explain how these two texts have things in common. Are they, related to each other because they're each offering, kind of insight into the creator of your text? Are each of these, sources connected because they're talking about a similar topic? What brings them together and how are they related to each other? And then finally, the anticipate section. Discuss how the source might relate to your argument and how you might use this source in a revision of the PSA that includes secondary source integration. So this source is about this part, I should say, the anticipate portion of it is really about kind of talking through, how might you use the secondary source? You've described for us who put it together, you've summarized for us what it's about, and you've connected for us how it relates to your primary source, but we haven't understood quite yet how you would use or implement this secondary source in the course of your project, right? So this is where you would share specifics that you sketch out of. Maybe you had a close reading that focused on a certain critical detail in the text, and you're anticipating that the secondary source would help you to demonstrate more legitimacy behind that close reading. Or maybe the secondary source that you've selected would fit really well into your introductory section where you clarify, historical context, right? Be specific as to where you think you might use this secondary source in a revision of the PSA. I've provided for you here an example of what a citation and an annotation would look like from a student. And so here's the citation up top. The student has bolded it and they've put it so that the first line is not indented, but the remaining lines are indented, okay? And so you'll want to do a similar approach to your citation. Now with the annotation, you'll notice that nothing is indented. It is just one single spaced paragraph. And this single spaced paragraph is not indented or kind of manipulated in any way. This is really important. Although you're following the DISCA method to write your annotation, that does not mean you should break your paragraph up into parts. It means it should be a singular paragraph with single spaced formatting, okay? So there should not be double spaced formatting in this paragraph. Your entire document should be single spaced, which is different than how we've approached the papers, of course, in the past, but it's just a different structure that is needed for an annotated bibliography. Now, what I've gone ahead and done here is, if you'll notice, this is the same annotation and citation as the previous slide, except whereas this one is shown all together, here I've highlighted each of the different parts so that you can kind of see different examples of what DISCA looks like in an annotation, okay? And so again, you're not going to break these apart into separate paragraphs for your annotated bibliography, but it can be helpful to look at them in a step-by-step capacity. You'll notice that this student definitely prioritized the describe and summarize portions of their annotation. They really concentrated on kind of the credentials and background of their writers, along with the credibility of the journal that they selected this source from, all of which is fine. But we want to see a little bit more here in this anticipate section, right? They tell us that the article can be used to provide scientific data and analysis as to why the bears decided to act in the manner that they did. Additionally, it can be used to analyze the society and the show that everyone is a part of this tote life with the hopes of helping the environment. So in this anticipate section, my note to them would be, adding 1 to 2 additional sentences where you really clarify, where in the paper would you use the scientific data and analysis? Would it fit into the introductory section? Would you pair it with the close readings? Would you put it in the concluding section? Where would you locate this particular source in your paper? Okay. So this is a really helpful example of kind of what kinds of information to cover based on each of these sections. And then when we look here at the connect section, right, they kind of give us a little bit of a recap and summary. In this case, the student decided to write about an episode, right? And so the connect section is pretty good here in that they, kind of use some of the language that they introduce in the summarize section and bring it into their close reading of the episode. This is another example that I've pulled here so you can kind of see a couple of different ways that students have approached this. So once again, your citation is the information up top that tells us where to find the source and kind of gives us information on its location. The annotation is going to be where you actually apply the DISCA method. Now for this student, I once again also broke it up into little chunks for you so that you can kind of see how they go about breaking down each of these different pieces. Now here you'll notice that this student really prioritized the connect section of all of them and did so in such a way that allowed them to kind of apply the arguments that they very kind of concisely but effectively discuss in the summary section and bring it into their discussion of the text, which works really nicely. And in doing that, it kind of helps to set a foundation for this anticipate section. But again, your anticipate should be really clear about where you would potentially incorporate the secondary source into your existing paper, or kind of state that you might create a whole new section in your paper that would make space for this secondary source, okay? All right, so now let's talk about the secondary source research process. So for this process, there are 3 steps of casting a wide net, narrowing it down once you know what you are looking for, and selecting the most credible sources. So where to begin is casting a wide net. Head to a more general search engine first. When in Google, start out by searching the creator's name and the name of the text. This allows you to cast the widest net possible to see what's out there. Otherwise, you might not encounter certain sources. From there, you can try 2 different options, such as Google News and Google Scholar, and I've provided some links here. Now, you're going to want to look for any of the following: articles in online magazines and newspapers, interviews, books, scholarly articles, etc. Pay attention to and write down when and where it was published. You might also incorporate in a source that is on YouTube, such as a video interview with the creator, but you will want to stick with interviews conducted by news/pop culture organizations like CNN or The Hollywood Reporter. So by that, I mean, you don't necessarily want to just pick any random video off of YouTube. You want to still make sure that you are applying this process of, evaluating their credentials and determining that if this is a credible source. And it does help to develop 3 to 5 key concepts or key phrases that relate to your primary source and to a concept related to Americanness. So again, by casting a wide net, you're going to start by moving to a general search engine first to kind of just see if you can find anything related to the creator by using their name, just to see what is out there before kind of focusing in on specific platforms. And I include some links to some specific databases on our Carmen page. And then you kind of focus in on what types of text might be useful to you, in part by applying key concepts or key phrases. Now, gradually, it's helpful to be more specific in your search. So try adding additional words that describe what you're looking for that relate to the creator or text. By modifying what you are writing into Google, different search results may appear. So examples of what to add to your Google search include the franchise that the text is part of, audience reception or audience response to the text, the year that the text was released, interviews given by the creator in a particular time frame, if there's a controversy attached, etc. So a general search to start out with, and we're going to use Miley Cyrus as kind of our example here. A general search to start out with would be Miley Cyrus, right? Nothing specific there. It could really bring in anything and everything related to Miley Cyrus. And another general search would be like, "We can't stop music video," right? Because you're going to kind of just get any search result that maybe references or talks about that music video in some way. Now, specific informational search terms that would kind of focus in your analysis a little bit more would be something like audience reactions to Miley Cyrus bangers era, Miley Cyrus talks about Hannah Montana, Miley Cyrus queer representation, Miley Cyrus we can't stop. So you'll notice that each of these would yield different results slightly on the basis that you're kind of focusing or emphasizing different facets of this same topic, right? So if you're focusing on, kind of this general search of Miley Cyrus, again, it could be absolutely anything related to her. Whereas these specific terms are going to help you kind of be able to tweak your Google search results to potentially get things that are a bit more useful to you as opposed to things that are more broad and generalized. So again, another way that you might think about this would be kind of going to Google Scholar. Now, Google Scholar, you can reach by typing in scholar.google.com. And if you look here, I typed in Miley Cyrus to the search bar and it brings down some suggested, kind of key terms that other people have typed into their searches of her, right? So controversy, VMA, influence, sexuality, etc. So you may find that when you're typing in a name to the search bar, there might be a recommended search term that you want to go ahead and pursue to see what comes up for it. Now, when I typed in Miley Cyrus and I chose to just kind of ultimately not add anything to this search process, I got everything from, Miley Cyrus's memoir, Miles to Go, to different articles that kind of emphasize different things like kind of her twerking and her proximity to Blackness. You also see kind of texts that focus on celebrity feminism, so they're a little bit more broad as opposed to focusing exclusively on Miley Cyrus, right? And so sometimes you might find that one of these sources that doesn't exclusively focus on your creator or your text can still be incredibly useful depending on what argument or kind of what details they're electing to focus on, right? Now, when I tweaked my search kind of terms to Miley Cyrus transformation, you'll notice that some of the terms change slightly. So whereas on the previous slide, we have her memoir, this YouTube twerking and you, taking time between G-string changes to educate ourselves as our kind of our first 3 search items, right? Here we have the importance of not being Miley, Hannah Montana and Miley Cyrus, and what Gen Y really wants. So we have a little bit of a different search kind of option breakdown already, right? Depending on what terms that you're using, because when you're typing in these search terms, they are basically kind of telling the search engine to look for texts that have this kind of focus in them in some capacity, okay? Now, when I switched my search item to Miley Cyrus cultural appropriation, you'll notice that this article that we've already mentioned kind of still shows up at the top, as well as this one right here, but we have a few different options that are a bit lower down. So you may notice that depending on how you are selecting your key terms, you might get some of the same articles over and over, whereas that might signal to you that you might need to come up with a different search term of some kind. And that doesn't mean that the ones that come up over and over are not helpful. It just might mean that depending on what you're looking for, if you're finding that you're not wanting to work with those, then you might want to adjust your search terms a little bit more. And I kind of, scroll down here to show other options of some of the texts that come up. A personal favorite of mine is this title, Miley Cyrus and the Murder of Hannah Montana. Of course, when you're thinking about a creator like Miley Cyrus, they are obviously someone that is very well known. And so to some extent, there's going to be more material available for her, especially because of that kind of shock value period in her career. You might be working with a creator who doesn't have as many sources available or as much kind of writing about them available. And that's okay. That's still workable. It just might mean that your approach is going to need to be one in which you really think about what are the topics or concepts or themes around this text that I'm focusing on, rather than going in from kind of a creator first perspective, okay? Now, I wanted to also kind of briefly show, and these are old screenshots, so please note that these are kind of old news stories on Miley Cyrus, but I wanted to just kind of briefly show an example of the difference between using Google Scholar as opposed to Google News. So Google Scholar gave you a lot of academic articles about, how people are writing about Miley Cyrus in academia, whereas Google is going to give you kind of anyone and everyone who's writing about Miley Cyrus and whatever it is that they're talking about in regards to her, okay? So if we look at kind of ways that you can potentially filter through Google search results, would be to focus in on the news tab. where you can kind of, instead of just kind of going to the all section, which is going to give you a bunch of kind of very general search results, the news tab might give you some, write-ups from various online, journals or newspapers, or not journals, I'm sorry, online newspapers or magazines rather, that have talked about Miley Cyrus in some regard. And so depending on if you're writing about a text that features a well-known creator, the news tab might be a useful way to get more information or to just kind of have some contemporary context for them. This is particularly useful for anyone who's writing in a annotated bibliography where they're thinking about, what secondary source might be useful to add to my introductory section on context. Now, if you go to the all section, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to get specific search results unless you really are strategic about those keywords we talked about, right? So here I input Miley Cyrus cultural appropriation, and you'll notice that the results are a bit more specific compared to if you just typed in Miley Cyrus. So you're going to want to really be thoughtful about what are the key terms that are going to help to emphasize the facets of this creator or this text or this issue that I really want to find search results on. Now, another incredibly helpful place to go to would be the OSU library website, which I've included a link to on our Carmen page. And, the library website is a little confusing to navigate, but I do encourage you to either select the Books and More tab or the Articles tab. I have also made it so that this image is hyperlinked, that if you click on it, it should take you right away to the OSU library site. But when you're on the site, I have found that the most useful way to find sources to work with would be to select the Books and More tab and then type in my keywords, or the Articles tab and then type in my keywords. So you'll notice that once again, I typed in Miley Cyrus as kind of a general search term to see what would come up. And it was, some interviews that she did, but nothing necessarily useful to me if I were planning to, elaborate on Miley Cyrus in specific ways in an annotated bibliography and potentially a final project. Now, when I typed in Miley Cyrus cultural appropriation, it gets a little bit more specific. I think also this titled the kind of here where it's kind of putting together different people who have committed acts of cultural appropriation or potentially kind of looking at things side by side. Those types of texts can be potentially useful depending on where they are from. And you'll notice that when you have this kind of drop down search result, it'll show you, what type of text it is, and it'll show you where they get this information from. Now, one strategy you might want to employ or kind of deploy depending on what you're looking for, and if you're looking at a specific time frame, would be in this kind of left-hand column here, you'll see that it says publication year, and then it'll show kind of all, but then also last 5 years, last 10 years, and last 25 years. If you select one of those options, what it'll do is it'll limit how many articles are being filtered for you so that you can prioritize looking for, writing that comes from a specific period of time. So if it's a priority to you to only have writings that come from the last 5 years for whatever reason, then you'll want to select that 5-year option. And then it'll prevent older, writings from coming up in your search results. If you are looking at kind of something that maybe is a pop culture term or theme or issue that has changed or transformed or evolved in the last few years, it might be helpful and useful to limit how many sources you're getting, because maybe it's outside of the scope of your argument to think about how this topic functioned 25 years ago. Now, one thing you can also kind of think about is, so when you click on these different article options, it'll bring up this new window, and you'll see that, kind of in terms of checking for availability, it'll either show that it is available at the library, or it'll say, request through interlibrary loan. And all that means is just that a librarian has to do an extra step for you to get this article, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue this article in your annotated bibliography. What it will mean is that you'll have to sign into your OSU library account if you're not already logged in already, and you'll click on this interlibrary loan button. And what you'll do is you'll fill out a little digital form where you provide the information for what the article is, and then it'll send it off to a librarian, and they will get the permission for that journal article for you if it's already not in the system. Okay. So please don't feel intimidated if you see this thing come up. If you need support filling out an interlibrary loan form, please feel free to reach out to me via email or during office hours, and we can definitely do that together. And so this is what it'll look like, right? You'll type in the author's name, the title, the journal, and so on. However, if you are typing in the journal title and you notice that it says something like essence.com or I don't know, times.com, et cetera, what that means is that you're actually typing in a text that the OSU library database picked up on that is a website, but it isn't a journal, which means you can just go to that website and type in that article title and you should be able to access it through just regular Google, okay? So sometimes the interlibrary loan process can also be a useful way for you to figure out, what texts or materials maybe have come up as, relevant or related searches to what you're looking for, but aren't necessarily provided to you through the OSU library site, okay? And again, when you're looking through these articles, you should see a red button that says view full text. And what that signals to you is that the OSU library system does indeed have a PDF version of this article that once you click on view full text, you'll be able to download it and read it and use it for your annotated bibliography, okay? So it's just a matter of figuring out, is the full text available through OSU or is it one that I'm gonna have to go through a couple extra steps to get? I oftentimes like to pair Google Scholar and the OSU library system together, where I'll first look for articles or kind of scholarly materials on Google Scholar, and then I'll go to the OSU library system and type them in to see that if they have a copy of it on hand. Okay, so that is everything that I have for you in English 1110. I hope that this lecture was helpful for you in terms of thinking about what is the kind of structure of the annotated bibliography, but how do you even get to the point that you have things to say? And how do you even get to the point that you have things that you have researched and are able to use as your secondary sources? If you are struggling or having any issues, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Depending on what your primary source is for the primary source analysis, you might need to think a little bit bigger beyond the individual creator or the individual text as a way into thinking about your secondary sources, which is in part why selecting concepts from class and selecting themes to focus on from class are going to be a helpful first step to making sure that you have an argument to put together, but also search terms to work with to begin thinking about the secondary source process, okay? All right, everyone, have a good rest of your week, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.